Sorry, but we can't just hand out cash to anyone who walks in here," branch manager Jessica Harper said, her voice soft yet dripping with disdain as she pushed the withdrawal slip of the simple woman, Amelia Carter, back across the counter, especially with amounts this large. Her words echoed through the lavish marble lobby of Meridian Bank's flagship branch, where a circle of employees had gathered as if preparing to witness a great drama. A young staff member leaned her head slightly and whispered to a colleague, but deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear, "Yeah, she looks like she only has a few pennies in her pocket." A quiet, mocking laugh spread across the group of employees behind the counter. Amelia, the unassuming woman who held the most power in this bank, stood there, her posture straight, her face calm, unaffected. Every second that passed felt like a cold knife cutting into her dignity, but Amelia didn't flinch. What these employees didn't know was that the moment they mocked her would be the turning point that would end their careers. Because right after, the woman they had underestimated would reveal her true identity. And with just a brief phone call, the entire proud flagship branch would witness its darkest day in history. Have you ever been judged for your humble appearance, only for others to discover who you really are? If you have, this story will give you one of the most satisfying, instant karma moments you've ever seen. The story begins when Amelia Carter appeared, quietly, without fanfare. She wore a simple navy hoodie, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes. No designer labels, no flashy accessories. Just a handcrafted leather bag, faded from years of use. Amelia walked directly up to the counter, standing tall, her gaze steady. She placed a withdrawal slip and her ID on the counter, her voice polite but firm. "I would like to withdraw $115,000 from my account." The counter fell silent for a brief moment. Beth Monroe, the young teller, froze for an instant. Her eyes quickly scanned the withdrawal slip, then shifted up to Amelia, from head to toe, with a look of doubt and barely concealed mockery. Not far away, Mike Sanders, another teller, was organizing a stack of files. Upon catching Beth's knowing look, Mike walked over, whispering just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "She looks like she borrowed a few bucks." A burst of quiet laughter rang out from the customer service desk. Some of the waiting customers began to glance at Amelia, eyes filled with pity, suspicion, even ridicule. Amelia heard every word, every glance, every short laugh mixed in the air thick with luxury. But she didn't change her expression. She was used to those looks all her life. Only this time, those laughing at her didn't know the woman they were mocking wasn't just a customer at Meridian Bank. She was the head of this entire financial empire. Beth awkwardly pulled the withdrawal slip back, leaned over her computer, and began to tap on the keyboard repeatedly, as if checking the information. In reality, it was just an excuse to stall. Mike, still standing nearby, folded his arms across his chest, looking on suspiciously as if Amelia might cause trouble at any moment. Another employee, Richard Evans, sitting at the next counter, crossed his legs and eyed Amelia with a mix of amusement and disdain. He nudged his colleague and whispered, "Must have won the lottery or something." Each of those words, each half-smile, was like a silent knife poking at Amelia's pride. But she stood tall, unmoving, unreacting, like a rock amidst the rushing, dirty waters. The soft sound of a piano playing over the bank's PA system could not mask the undercurrent of sophisticated contempt spreading through the air like poisonous smoke. None of them knew that, in less than 10 minutes, everything they took for granted, from their jobs to their careers, would be ripped apart by none other than the woman they had just disrespected as an outsider in this sacred temple of money. And Amelia Carter was just getting started. Amelia Carter stood there, silently enduring the glances and sarcastic remarks as she had so many storms in her life before. But behind that calm exterior was an ocean of memories churning, memories that no one in this lavish bank would ever bother to care about or know. 25 years ago, in this very building, Amelia had stood behind the counter, wearing an oversized light blue uniform and a simple plastic name tag, Amelia Carter, trainee. No powerful family backing her, no one holding the door open for her to enter this cold world of finance. She had only one thing to carry, an unshakable determination, as cold as ice, and a sharp intellect that no one had yet been astute enough to notice beneath her humble appearance. In those early days, Amelia had to endure condescending glances, harsh comments from people just like Beth Monroe or Mike Sanders today, people who believed that a designer jacket or a Mont Blanc pen were the true measures of worth. While other tellers were selected for intensive training, Amelia was given menial tasks, sorting files, counting coins, handling risky accounts that no one else wanted to touch. Many nights she sat alone in the dark storage room, surrounded by thousands of yellowing files, learning to read credit forms, analyze failed loans, teaching herself things that no one bothered to show her. No applause, no encouragement. Just relentless perseverance, like a steady stream carving away at a large rock. And little by little, Amelia began to make a difference. The accounts she managed started turning a profit. Branches that had been losing money were quietly restructured by her, each credit score she rebuilt, each old client who returned thanks to the upright service she inspired in her team. Amelia didn't just work, she built. She didn't just meet targets, she shattered limits. In a system that favored only the right kind, she advanced through something no one could ignore: undeniable results. After 6 years of hard work, Amelia was sent to Harvard for an MBA program. Not because of favors, but because of the scholarship she earned through hard numbers. When she returned to Meridian, she was no longer a timid trainee, she was a natural leader. A woman who understood that real change starts within the silent numbers, the small decisions made daily, not from polished speeches. Gradually, from credit officer, she became branch manager. From branch manager, she became regional director. 3 times, Amelia saved 3 branches on the brink of closure, each time bringing them back into the top 5 of the region. Her performance reports even caused board members to lower their heads and reconsider. But with every step forward, she never forgot that no matter how successful she became, a worn hoodie could still make people underestimate her true potential, simply because of her appearance. That bitter understanding was what made Amelia never accept glamorous reports if they didn't come with true fairness. 5 years ago, as Chief Operating Officer, COO, many believed she'd hit the glass ceiling. But Amelia wasn't born to stop where others set limits. 3 months ago, after a tense board meeting, after reluctant glances and unspoken questions full of bias, she became the CEO of Meridian Bank. A victory not only for herself but for everyone who had been looked down upon just because they didn't fit the right mold. And today she returned, in her simple attire, with no insignia, no power draped over her shoulders, to face the problem that the reports had failed to address: discrimination, prejudice, and the silent contempt eating away at the bank she loved from within. When Mike Sanders' mocking look and Richard Evans' laughter echoed through the lobby, Amelia simply curled the corner of her lips into a smile that was almost unnoticeable. Not because she was hurt, but because she knew. They had just bet their careers on a single wrong glance. And the game had only just begun. Amelia Carter stood there, her expression unshaken, like a cold rock amidst the whirlwind of prejudiced glances. Not in a hurry, not anxious, she calmly stepped back, seeking an empty seat near the glass window, where she could observe the entire scene of the main lobby without obstruction. She knew that to see the truth, sometimes you need to take a step back and carefully examine what the glossy exterior is trying to hide. This flagship branch, with its polished marble floors and high-vaulted ceilings, was designed to impress. It wasn't just a bank. It was a subtle statement of power, a silent declaration of class stratification that required no words. Every detail, from the employees' sharp uniforms to the layout of the service areas, was quietly sending a clear message. This place belonged to those who fit the right mold. And so, while she waited, a wait she knew was intentionally being prolonged, Amelia began to witness the true nature of this seemingly perfect system. The automatic door opened, gently but decisively. A white man, dressed in a pricey Armani suit, walked in. His Rolex gleamed beneath his perfectly pressed cuff. Immediately, a female receptionist stepped away from the counter and approached with a bright smile. "Good morning, sir. How can we assist you today?" No need to take a number. No need to wait in line. The businessman was led straight to a private desk, where a specialist was already waiting as if she had known his presence in advance. Amelia sat quietly, observing it all in silence. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, this time to reveal an elderly couple. The husband leaned on a cane, and the wife wore a faded cardigan. No one greeted them, no warm smile. One employee simply pointed to the waiting area with a dry gesture, offering no polite invitation. "Please take a number and wait." They silently followed, the elderly woman casting a brief glance at Amelia, a tired look, not surprised, as though she was too familiar with being invisible in places like this. Amelia gripped the armrest of her chair, but her expression remained calm. She didn't need to guess any further. What she had witnessed confirmed all the silent doubts she had held over the past months. Another 10 minutes passed. A man in a blue janitor uniform entered, his cap pulled low over his face from the drizzle outside. He held a small check in his hand, nervously walking toward the counter. The same receptionist who had eagerly welcomed the businessman earlier instantly changed her demeanor. "Please show me 2 forms of ID." Her voice was cold, no smile, no friendly gaze. The man rummaged through his jacket pocket, finally pulling out his ID and driver's license, while the eyes of the other employees collectively fixed on him, as though he had committed some great offense simply by entering this space. The receptionist scrutinized every detail carefully, then whispered to Mike Sanders, who was standing nearby. Mike glanced at the janitor, frowned, then nodded. 10 minutes later, when the transaction was finally approved, the man bowed deeply in thanks, as if he owed gratitude for being allowed access to his own hard-earned money. Amelia felt a tightening in her throat, but she swallowed down all her emotions. This was why she was here today. Not to get angry, but to witness it firsthand. To prove, through actual experience, that the problem wasn't just on paper. It ran deep in every action, every smile, every frown here. The door opened again, this time to reveal a young woman with blonde curls, wearing a Burberry coat, fashionably ripped jeans, and pristine white sneakers. She walked straight to the counter, no number, no waiting. Beth Monroe, who had been stiff with Amelia earlier, suddenly broke into a bright smile. "Hello. Beautiful day, isn't it? How can I assist you?" In less than 3 minutes, the transaction was completed. The young woman giggled, waved cheerfully, then strode out of the bank, leaving behind a cold contrast that couldn't have been more obvious. Amelia silently took note, not just how they served, but also the speed, the tone of voice, the body language. Everything changed depending on appearance, attire, and the implicit assumptions they placed on customers. She looked over at Beth Monroe, seeing the young woman chatting and laughing with Mike Sanders. Mike's gaze scanned the lobby, stopping briefly at Amelia, then quickly moving on, as though her presence was an inconvenience to endure. Not far off, Richard Evans, still absent-mindedly fiddling with a pen, occasionally glanced at the newly arrived customer and exchanged a knowing look with his colleague. A body language full of arrogance, a language that didn't need words to assert who the insiders were here, and Amelia saw it all, every little action, every glance, every irritated smirk. A picture of silent class division, subtle, smooth, wrapped in the guise of professional service. But under the eyes of someone who had experienced it like Amelia, it was stark and chilling. She knew well that such actions would never show up in quarterly reports. No number would reflect that coldness. No customer survey would dig deep enough to touch the root of the issue. But it was happening. Every day, every hour, and it was slowly eroding the soul of Meridian Bank, the very institution she had built her career on. Amelia glanced at her watch. It had been over 37 minutes since she handed in her withdrawal slip. 3 other customers who arrived after her had already been served and left. And she was still sitting there, waiting to see just how far they would go in their subtle discrimination. Once more, the bank's door opened, but this time the person walking in would not be just an ordinary customer. This was the moment that would open the earthquake set to drown all the complacency that had seeped into these cold marble stones. And Amelia Carter, the simple woman in the faded hoodie, was ready. Amelia Carter didn't need to check the time. She knew it had been far too long compared to the service standards of a flagship branch like Meridian. Every second she sat there quietly waiting was not just a test of patience, it was a sophisticated trial. A test to see how she would react to the subtle yet cold discrimination. Finally, when the indifference had almost reached a level of rudeness, Beth Monroe, the young teller who hid her uneasy gaze behind thick mascara, reluctantly gestured for Amelia to approach counter number 3. Without haste, without showing any frustration, Amelia stood up, the worn leather of her bag gently brushing her hip with each slow step. The light above reflected off the polished stone floor, illuminating every sideways glance, every mocking smile from the employees pretending to be busy behind the counter. Amelia walked over and gently placed the withdrawal slip and her identification on the counter, as if preparing for a ritual. She didn't need to say anything else. All the necessary information was already neatly presented in the slip and ID in front of Beth. However, when Beth's eyes scanned the clearly marked $115,000 on the slip, the young woman's body seemed to freeze for a moment. Her fingers, which had been tapping unconsciously on the counter, suddenly stopped, then awkwardly clenched around the edge of the counter as if trying to keep her composure. A brief furrow of her brow, then Beth immediately looked up and exchanged a quick glance with Mike Sanders, standing a few steps away, clearly ready for such a situation. Mike didn't need to be called twice. He strode towards the counter, his broad shoulders acting like a physical presence of pressure, and positioned himself behind Beth, forming a living wall of intimidation. His voice rang out, intentionally loud enough to silence the entire transaction area. "Is there a problem with this transaction?" The question was not directed at Beth, the one handling the counter. It was aimed directly at Amelia, like an unspoken punch, like an accusation before it could even be formed. Curious, tentative eyes mixed with a bit of eagerness from the other customers immediately turned toward Amelia, as if she had just inadvertently triggered a security crisis in the middle of the bank. Unflinching, Amelia lifted her chin, her steady gaze meeting Mike's. When her voice rose, it was still soft, but carried with it a chilling decisiveness. "There's no problem. I'm simply withdrawing money from my own account." Beth, now completely caught up in the whirlwind of suspicion that Mike had initiated, began nervously double-checking the paperwork. She checked the ID 3 times, as if hoping to find a small mistake to justify the confusion building in the transaction area. Mike frowned, his arms crossed over his chest, signaling distrust. A withdrawal this large needs to be carefully verified. We've had a few cases of fraud recently. Do you understand? His words echoed in the space, followed by whispers around the room. A middle-aged woman in a business dress murmured to her companion, "Look at her. Who would believe it?" A middle-aged man in a suit shook, his head, his gaze gleaming with judgment. Probably won the lottery or something shady. Amelia stood still, her brown eyes as calm as a stormy sea, unruffled, unwavering. She knew those whispers. She had heard them since she was a child, ever since the first time she stepped into a world where people judged you by your appearance. And she knew, right now, if she let her emotions take over, if she reacted impulsively, those people, Beth, Mike, Richard, would have the perfect excuse to validate their unfair suspicions. So, Amelia smiled lightly, her smile polite yet laced with irony. "I completely understand. That's why I've prepared all the necessary documents. If you need further confirmation, please proceed according to the usual procedures." A heavy silence followed. Beth lowered her head to the keyboard, entering the data into the system, while Mike still stood there like a shadow of suspicion. His shoulders slouched, his arms tightly crossed, his gaze never ceasing to scrutinize. Not stopping there, Mike leaned over Beth's shoulder, glancing at the computer screen, then smirked. "Her account activity seems quite unusual. Definitely needs a deeper check." Richard Evans, from the counter across the room, caught the signal, stepped closer, and whispered, deliberately loud enough for a few nearby customers to overhear, "Could be money laundering or identity fraud." The words, the looks, the smirk, all were like poisoned daggers, stabbing into Amelia's calm, trying to provoke a reaction they could exploit. Beth hesitated, typed a few commands into the system, then looked up, her voice no longer maintaining the thin veneer of professionalism. "Sorry. Could you explain the source of this money? This is a large sum." It was the question that, from the moment she stepped in, Amelia knew had been reserved for customers who didn't fit. A question no Armani-suited man, no blonde-haired, curly girl, those who had just left with large transactions, would ever face. Amelia looked directly at Beth, her gaze steady as if reading an old poem. "This is my money in my account at this bank, which I am withdrawing. I don't see the need for further explanation. If you have evidence I'm breaking the law, please present it. Otherwise, proceed with the transaction as usual." No raising her voice, no provocation, just a gentle reminder, sharp as a thin blade, cutting through the false professionalism of the charade. Beth swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. Mike, unwilling to back down, turned to signal Richard. "Call Jessica. Call the branch manager." A command. A new escalation in the storm of suspicion they had been creating, each blow aimed at one simple woman, just because she dared to demand what was rightfully hers. And Amelia, that woman, just tightened the strap of her old leather bag, her gaze calm but her mind already counting down. How far would they go in this farce they had created? And would they realize when the storm truly hit that the person they were facing was not just a regular customer, but a storm waiting to sweep away the rotting arrogance that had built up over time? The storm had only just begun. The atmosphere in the main lobby of Meridian Bank's flagship branch seemed to thicken, heavy with scrutinizing gazes and whispered contempt. Amelia Carter stood still, her expression so calm it seemed almost indifferent, while beneath the surface of that stillness, she could clearly feel the subtle waves churning. The disdain, the suspicion, the coldness embodied in the looks, the smirking smiles, and the whispered mockery from those around her. It didn't take long. As Beth Monroe nervously punched in the familiar internal numbers, the sound of high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor echoed closer. Jessica Harper, the branch manager, appeared. Jessica moved with the gait of someone accustomed to commanding the space around them with their personal presence. Each step strong, back straight, eyes scanning like a supervisor inspecting new recruits. She wore a meticulously tailored gray suit, a pricey Cartier watch peeking out from under her sleeve, and a plum-colored silk scarf loosely tied around her neck, all combining perfectly to create the image of a successful, powerful woman, so confident it bordered on arrogance. But when Jessica's gaze fell on Amelia, what flickered in her eyes was not professional courtesy, but a cold, almost palpable judgment, laced with a contempt that was hard to hide. Jessica approached, a mechanical, polite smile stretching across her lips, yet her eyes remained icy, her voice even and laden with a false sense of protectiveness. "Hello, I'm Jessica Harper, the branch manager. I understand you wish to make a large cash withdrawal today." Before Amelia could respond, Jessica continued, lowering her voice as if speaking to a child. "However, according to our security policy, we cannot hand out large sums of cash to anyone unless there is special verification." She paused for a moment, deliberately emphasizing the words anyone, her eyes sweeping over Amelia as if to make it clear she was the exception, the anyone this referred to. The air in the lobby grew taut, as if everyone, customers and employees alike, could feel the underlying tension simmering beneath the thin veneer of politeness. Amelia, still standing tall, her brown eyes unwavering as they locked with Jessica's, spoke in a calm voice. "I have provided all the necessary documentation. The amount I'm withdrawing is within the legal limits of my personal account. I expect to be served like any other customer." A brief hesitation, enough for Amelia to notice, then Jessica tilted her head, a thin, almost imperceptible smile forming, her voice tinged with cold pity. "Perhaps you should try a currency exchange shop down the street. They're more accustomed to handling these types of transactions. We, I'm afraid, cannot process your request here." The sweet-sounding suggestion echoed in the silent space, like a knife slipping smoothly into Amelia's dignity. A long, endless moment passed. No one moved. No one laughed anymore. Even the hushed whispers that had filled the air earlier fell silent. Every eye in. The lobby, from the waiting customers to the tellers, was now fixed on Amelia, a collective gaze full of interrogation, suspicion, and contempt. In their eyes, she was no longer a person with outstanding achievements. She was no longer the leader of the organization beneath whose roof they stood. She was no longer a customer entitled to service as promised by Meridian Bank. She was simply a problem, an outsider, someone to be excluded, deftly but decisively. Jessica, sensing the upper hand, smiled once more, this time unable to hide her subtle sense of triumph. "You understand, don't you? We're just trying to keep our customers safe. There are places more suited for this kind of transaction. Here, we have standards." Standards. The word passed through the air like a lash of leather, striking sharply against the skin. Their standards, clearly, did not include people like Amelia, or customers who didn't wear the facade of class. Amelia gazed deep into Jessica Harper's eyes, and in that moment, she saw one thing clearly. It wasn't because Jessica lacked information, nor was she genuinely concerned for the bank's safety. It was simply prejudice. A prejudice so deep-rooted, it clung to the shiny surface like poisonous roots beneath the soil. The prejudice that anyone who dressed simply, who didn't flaunt wealth, who didn't belong to the lavish display of status, was undeserving. That prejudice made Jessica feel that denying Amelia was justified. It made her believe she was protecting the brand values by pushing people like Amelia out the door. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering, each word clear and cold. I understand perfectly. And I also believe what's happening here will not stop in this lobby. A cold flicker appeared in Amelia's eyes, sharp enough to make Beth, who was standing behind the counter, shudder slightly. But Jessica didn't notice, or perhaps deliberately chose not to. The long-standing confidence in her small power at this branch had blinded her, making her unaware that she was beginning a storm she wouldn't be able to control. Jessica waved her hand, as if trying to end the conversation. If you can't comply with our process, I'll have to ask you to leave the branch. Or I'll have to involve security. Amelia smiled lightly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then slowly pulled out a phone from her bag, her slender fingers gliding over the smooth touch screen. The silence enveloped the entire lobby. Mike Sanders and Richard Evans stood nearby, their victorious looks tinged with some caution, while Beth Monroe silently clenched her hands under the counter. They all thought they had the upper hand. They had no idea that in that moment they had crossed a line they could never return from. Amelia held the phone to her ear, her voice calm and soft, but each word rang like a death knell. Diane, I'm at the flagship branch. We need you here now. A short sentence, but its echo was like the first thunderclap of a storm, signaling that the real storm had just begun. Amelia Carter's warm, composed voice had barely left the phone when an almost invisible ripple began to spread throughout the main lobby of Meridian Bank. No one knew exactly what had just transpired, but that strange sensation, an unnamed shift, made the already tense atmosphere even heavier. Amelia lowered the phone and tucked it into her worn leather bag with deliberate slowness, each motion precise and almost cold in its formality. She turned back to face Jessica Harper, still standing there, arms crossed in front of her chest, a face blending irritation with a firm belief that she was in the right. A belief born from years of being sheltered by invisible privileges, where she never had to doubt herself for a second. Amelia spoke softly, but her voice resonated through the lobby. I request to speak with your superior, someone with actual authority. A pause hung in the air, as if freezing everything in place. Beth Monroe lifted her head from the computer screen. Richard Evans raised an eyebrow, and Mike Sanders almost let out a laugh. Jessica, regaining her arrogant confidence, leaned forward. Her polite smile shifted into a smirk, almost condescending. I am the highest authority at this branch. There is no one else you can appeal to. Jessica's voice was coated in a thin layer of sugar, the professional mask that small-time power holders often wear to conceal their authoritarian tendencies. But it was her gaze, no longer patient, now looking through Amelia as though she were an unwanted burden, that revealed the truth. Amelia did not respond immediately. She only smiled faintly, stepped back a pace, as if giving space for Jessica's own arrogance to expose itself. Mike Sanders and Richard Evans, the silent accomplices since the beginning, seized the opportunity to stir the air, which had thickened with awkwardness. Mike, with a mocking expression, placed his hands on his hips, nudged Richard with his elbow, and whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Oh, she's calling for backup." Richard chuckled mockingly, then shook his head with a smirk. In exaggerated motions, he mimicked Amelia, pulling an imaginary phone from his bag, tilting his head dramatically, pretending to dial, then mumbling as though rehearsing. "Hello, I'm the CEO of the bank. Come save me." They both burst into laughter, their sharp voices echoing through the lobby, attracting the curious yet confused looks of some customers waiting for their transactions. Some tried to cover their mouths to stifle their laughter. Others turned away, pretending not to hear. Even Beth Monroe, who had previously retained some semblance of conscience, bowed her head, her shoulders stiff with embarrassment. Amelia still did not react. No glare of anger, no complaints, no signs of dissent. She stood tall, her face calm, her brown eyes locked onto Mike and Richard as if she were piercing through the thin masks they had so carelessly donned. The real storm, she knew, did not need anger or shouting. The real storm came from silence, from patiently waiting, until the opponent revealed all their own filth. She had seen this countless times throughout her career. Those who relied on privilege, on the illusion of power, always allowed themselves to behave poorly, thinking no one would notice, that there would be no consequences. But they forgot that it was those very actions, the cheap laughter, the challenging looks, the public mockery, that were the clearest evidence of their true nature. Across the lobby, near the entrance, an elderly man in a postal worker uniform stood silently, observing. His wrinkled face, yet his sharp eyes tracked every detail, as though he was witnessing something he had seen all too often in his life. The arrogance of those who didn't realize they were digging their own graves. Jessica Harper, after waiting for Amelia to react the way she anticipated, with anger, loss of control, rebellion, began to lose patience. She snapped her fingers to signal Mike. "Call security." Mike nodded, casually walked over to the wall-mounted internal phone, picked up the receiver, and dialed quickly. Meanwhile, Amelia quietly glanced up at the clock hanging above the transaction area. 10:12 a.m. She knew Diane Walker wouldn't take more than 5 minutes to arrive. And when she did, all of the arrogance, all of the mockery, all of these thoughtless actions would have nowhere to hide. A young security officer, no more than 25, dressed in black, awkwardly approached. His gaze flickered repeatedly between Jessica, Mike, and Amelia, clearly confused, not fully understanding what was unfolding. Jessica, with a tense expression but still maintaining her professional facade, spoke sternly. "She's causing a disturbance, refusing to follow protocol. Please escort her out." Amelia looked directly at the security officer, her voice calm but every word carved deep into the space. "I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm a legal customer with an account at this bank, and I'm conducting a legitimate transaction with all the necessary identification. If anyone here is violating protocol, it is not me." The young security officer hesitated briefly. Clearly, he sensed something was off. Amelia's unwavering calm made him uneasy, a stark contrast to the disruptions he was trained to deal with. Jessica tightened her grip on her bag, her eyes sparking with fury. "If you don't leave, we'll have to take more drastic measures." Amelia's lips curled into a faint smile. The real storm was very close now. She only needed to wait just a few more minutes. In the thick air of waiting, the mocking laughter from earlier slowly faded, replaced by an undercurrent of tension, the primal sense that a storm was about to hit, but no one could quite identify its source. And then, from a distance, the soft ding of the elevator echoed. A small, delicate sound, but to Amelia, it was the signal. The wake-up call for those lost in their delusions of power. She knew, in just a moment, Jessica Harper and her accomplices would watch their world collapse entirely. The moment the elevator bell rang, another movement, silent but far more intense, began over 20 floors above, at the Meridian Bank headquarters. In the thick-carpeted, navy-blue conference room, under the cold glow of crystal chandeliers and large glass walls offering a sweeping view of the city, a high-level board meeting was in progress. Amidst the routine discussions about quarterly targets and cold growth numbers, the sudden appearance of an urgent call broke the steady rhythm of the meeting. Diane Walker, Executive Vice President, was focused on reviewing a report when her internal phone light blinked, showing a name, Amelia Carter. Just seeing that name, Diane knew. Something big was happening. Amelia was not the type to make a call for trivial matters. Without hesitation, Diane picked up the receiver and placed it to her ear. The familiar, calm voice, sharp as a thin blade, came through the receiver. "Diane, I'm at the flagship branch. There's something you need to handle right away." That was all, no more, no less. But to Diane, who had weathered countless storms with Amelia, just the tone in her voice was enough to make her stand up abruptly, her leather chair snapping back. Diane's face drained of color. Not from fear, but from the quiet rage bubbling up like magma within. Immediately, she turned, her voice a steel command. "Activate all the surveillance cameras at the flagship branch. Now, every angle, every microphone, from the first customer this morning." The security tech team, busy preparing reports for the regular meeting, froze for a moment, then began moving with a rare urgency. Large plasma screens mounted along the walls flickered to life, each frame from the surveillance cameras flooding in like a torrential downpour. The main lobby, the teller stations, the customer service areas, every detail from the flagship branch came into sharp focus, right down to the frowns, the condescending glances. Diane squinted, her cold gaze scanning every frame. In under a minute, she had grasped the entire picture. Amelia, the CEO of the bank, in simple attire, being treated like a suspicious outsider, right in the heart of the institution she had built over her career. At the same time, in the adjacent boardroom, the Meridian Board of Directors, the most powerful figures in the city's financial industry, were also receiving an alert. "Urgent issue involving the CEO. Please switch to the monitoring channel." At first, there were just uncomfortable glances mixed with surprise. Who dared interrupt a high-level meeting like this? But when the flagship branch footage appeared clearly on the wall screen, and they saw Amelia Carter surrounded by condescending tellers, challenged by an arrogant branch manager, publicly mocked by the counter staff, the entire room sank into a thick silence. No one spoke. Jonathan Prescott, the chairman, elderly yet sharp, gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles turning white from the strength of his hold. Beside him, Catherine Reynolds, a board member and senior strategic advisor, shuddered slightly, her mouth agape in disbelief. Dennis Whitehill, known for his cold and pragmatic nature, couldn't hide his pale shock when he realized how grave the situation had become. On the screen, Jessica Harper stood before Amelia, in a dominant stance, her arrogant voice coming through clearly thanks to the internal microphone system. "Perhaps you should try a currency exchange shop down the street. They're more suited for this kind of transaction." Diane Walker gripped her tablet tightly, her cold gaze sweeping through each camera angle like a hunting falcon. It wasn't just Jessica's refusal to serve. It wasn't just Mike Sanders and Richard Evans laughing and mocking. It was the entire branch system, from the tellers, the reception area, to the security staff, all silently complicit, unwittingly creating an invisible wall against the very head of the bank. Diane spun around, commanding the technical team, "Record all video. Cut out each segment of discrimination, each word, each gesture. I want the compressed copy immediately." She knew, both by instinct and experience, that they were facing not just an internal scandal, but a potential disaster in terms of legal, ethical, and reputational fallout. Inside the meeting room, Jonathan Prescott broke the silence with a stern voice. "What are we witnessing here?" No one answered, because the answer, though unspoken, was already clear before them. The collapse of the values that Meridian Bank had once proudly proclaimed. Diane Walker stood tall, her eyes as cold as ice, her voice leaving no room for delay. "Summon the legal team, call the entire board, cancel all other meetings, and prepare to head to the flagship branch immediately." Because she knew there was no time for discussion, no time for cover-ups. Once Amelia Carter, with all her power and position, chose to silently endure to the very end, allowing the system to expose its true face before acting, the outcome for the arrogant few at the lower levels had already been sealed. On the screen, the elevator ding sounded once more, signaling Diane's imminent arrival at the flagship branch. And from this moment on, the game was no longer in the hands of Jessica Harper, Mike Sanders, or Richard Evans. The real storm had reached its peak, and it would not let anyone escape unscathed. The ding from the elevator on the ground floor signaled Diane Walker's arrival, but at the same time, on the highest floors of Meridian Bank's headquarters, an irreversible chain of events had already begun unfolding. In the security monitoring room, where every breath, every subtle movement of the branches was recorded, rows of large screens covered the wall, streaming footage from the flagship branch. Every image, every sound was magnified clearly down to the smallest detail, leaving no room for any pretense or concealment. Diane Walker stood in the center of the room, gripping her tablet tightly, her cold gaze scanning the footage like a judge reading an indictment for those about to be sentenced. She wasn't looking for minor mistakes that could be overlooked. She was searching for the truth. And that truth was unfolding brutally, so stark that anyone witnessing it would feel a chill down their spine. On the first screen, the image of Beth Monroe handling Amelia Carter's transaction appeared. At first, there was the forced politeness in her expression, followed by a flicker of hesitation when she saw the amount being withdrawn, then a rushed call for Mike Sanders, as if facing a potential threat instead of a lawful customer. The scene quickly changed. The second screen showed Mike Sanders approaching, leaning toward the counter and immediately raising his voice, making everyone in the lobby take notice. The expression on his face was unmistakable, suspicion wrapped in the guise of security protocol. Next, a conversation rang out loudly through the internal microphone, the sharpness of the sound chilling. "Is there a problem with this transaction?" Mike questioned, his tone dripping with an underlying threat. "Look at her. Who would believe that?" Richard Evans sneered, his words cutting deep the moment Amelia politely asked to follow the process. Another camera angle captured Richard mimicking Amelia's posture as she called, pretending to be meek and sarcastically muttering, "I'm the CEO, help me." Mike's laughter followed, echoing throughout the lobby like a bell signaling the crumbling of everything Meridian Bank once prided itself on. The next camera angle showed Jessica Harper approaching, her eyes scanning Amelia from head to toe, as though examining an outsider who needed to be eliminated. Her words, though wrapped in a false mask of politeness, were filled with cold malice. "Maybe you should try a currency exchange shop down the street. We have standards here." On another screen, the camera captured the reactions of the customers in the lobby. A middle-aged woman, clutching her purse tightly, her eyes wary. A man in a suit whispered something to his companion, both of them laughing derisively. An elderly man at the corner of the room clenched his cane, his eyes heavy with disappointment and sorrow. Each of these details, every glance, every smile, every small gesture, painted a damning picture. Meridian Bank, their flagship branch, was operating on an unspoken, sharp, and ruthless system of bias. Diane Walker stood still before the flood of images and sounds, a cold fury building inside her. Not just because Amelia was being insulted, but because the very core values they had proclaimed to the world were now being shredded by the very employees who were supposed to uphold them. The monitoring room was almost frozen in place when Diane spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that pressed heavily on everyone present. Record all footage. Do not cut. Do not edit. I want every second, every minute saved. A young technician, pale and stammering, nodded. Understood, Vice President. She turned and strode quickly to the boardroom, where the powerful faces of the Meridian board were still focused on the large screen, their expressions growing heavier by the moment. Jonathan Prescott, the oldest and one of the founding members of Meridian Bank, slammed his hand down on the table. "What are we witnessing here?" His voice trembling with anger. "Blatant discrimination in our flagship branch. Against our very CEO?" Catherine Reynolds slowly spoke. Her cold eyes narrowed. "It's not just a personal insult, Jonathan. This is a violation of federal financial service laws. If this case gets exposed, we'll face fines, lawsuits, and irreparable reputational damage." Dennis Whitehill, now red-faced, gripped the file in front of him tightly. "Who is managing the flagship branch?" Diane Walker didn't need to check. Jessica Harper. 15 years of experience. A strong record. But if we dig deeper, there have been complaints about subtle discrimination that were overlooked in performance reviews. A heavy silence fell. Everyone knew they had turned a blind eye for years because of the pretty numbers on the reports. And now, that indifference was coming back to haunt them. Jonathan Prescott growled, "Go to the branch immediately. Everyone, no one is to be left out of this." And like an army preparing for battle, the entire board, and the most powerful people in the bank, stood up, leaving the meeting room and heading straight for the ground floor, where a storm was waiting to erupt. Down below, Amelia Carter stood, calm in the eye of the storm, while Jessica Harper, Mike Sanders, and Richard Evans had no idea that their fate had been sealed in those few cold frames. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, the soft mechanical sounds echoed, but the true storm was raging violently inside the hearts of those about to step through the door. Diane Walker, in a sharp navy suit, took long, decisive strides toward the flagship branch's main hall. Her gaze was cold as steel, her breathing steady as if counting down to the moment of confrontation. No warning, no polite knock. Only the sharp sound of the large glass door slamming open, crashing into the wall, causing the murmurs of conversation in the bank lobby to fall instantly silent. Everyone turned. The customers waiting for transactions, the employees sitting behind the counters, even the security guards who had stood motionless until that moment, all looked up, their eyes filled with shock and panic. Diane entered like a bolt of lightning in a clear sky. She didn't stop to observe. She didn't waste time with polite questions. She walked straight ahead, each step carrying the weight of an impending storm of power. In an instant, she stood in the center of the lobby, directly facing Jessica Harper, Mike Sanders, Richard Evans, and Amelia Carter, who stood still and composed, like a steadfast pillar amidst the chaos. Diane took a deep breath, then raised her voice, clear and firm, the sound echoing throughout the lobby. "Stop immediately." Her command struck the cold stone floor like thunder, freezing those who had once held the upper hand. Jessica, Mike, Richard, in their tracks, leaving them paralyzed. Beth Monroe, behind the counter, flinched, retreating as if she had seen a ghost. A few customers waiting for their transactions jumped, exchanging confused glances, afraid to speak a word. Diane didn't need anyone to ask or explain. She slowly turned, her gaze sweeping across the entire lobby like a laser beam, cold, precise, missing no one. Then she stopped, her gaze locked on Jessica Harper. Her voice rang out, each word punctuated like nails driven into wood. "You just humiliated your CEO, Amelia Carter." In that moment, all breath seemed to freeze. The air that had already been heavy seemed to drain from the room. Jessica Harper, the woman who had maintained a proud, cold demeanor until now, turned as pale as if she had been doused with a bucket of cold water in the middle of winter. She stammered, her voice trembling with none of the arrogance it once held. I didn't know. I didn't recognize." Diane took a step forward, each movement striking at the fragile layer of arrogance still clinging to Jessica's face. "Didn't know? Didn't recognize? You don't need to recognize anyone, Jessica Harper. Your job, your duty, is to serve every customer with respect, fairness, and dignity, no matter what they wear, how they look, or which door they enter. And you failed, miserably." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but Diane raised her hand, a decisive motion like a sharp cut, forcing her to remain silent. Mike Sanders and Richard Evans, now having shifted from mocking arrogance to confusion, stood pale and lost, glancing at each other desperately for a way out but finding nothing but Diane's icy glare and Amelia's calm yet sharp gaze. Amelia Carter still had not spoken a word. She simply stood there, silent, allowing those who had once mocked her to witness the unraveling of their careers. After taking a breath to suppress her anger, Diane turned to face the entire staff in the lobby, her voice not loud, but filled with authority. "Everyone here today will be a witness to what has happened. Everything has been recorded, every word, every action. No one is exempt." Beth Monroe covered her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. A few other employees began retreating behind the counters, as though hoping to disappear. Diane turned back to face Jessica, her voice lowered, but each word sharp as a blade. "I require you, Mike Sanders and Richard Evans, to submit your employee IDs, lock your internal access accounts, and leave the branch immediately. Effective immediately, no excuses, no chances for redemption." Jessica stood frozen, rigid like a statue. Mike Sanders turned pale, stammering but unable to say anything. Richard Evans stood still, his face ashen, his eyes staring vacantly into nothing. No more smiles, no more condescending glances, no more arrogance. Only defeated individuals, exposed and vulnerable under the harsh light of day. Another security guard, a seasoned middle-aged man, stepped up to replace the young guard from earlier. Without needing a word, he silently collected the employee IDs from Jessica, Mike, and Richard, then led them out through the lobby, under the gaze of hundreds of eyes, eyes filled with judgment, disappointment, and disdain. Amelia Carter, still composed, merely nodded silently at Diane, a silent thank you. The first purge was complete, but the storm was far from over. Behind them, the glass door swung open once more, and the board of directors, Jonathan Prescott, Catherine Reynolds, Dennis Whitehill, entered, their faces grim, their gazes steely. They didn't need to ask what was happening, because everything was already crystal clear. The true confrontation between a corrupt, decaying system and the power of justice had just begun, right where every brick, every pane of glass, had once proudly borne the label Excellence of Meridian Bank. And this time, no one would shield the arrogant. The atmosphere in the Meridian Bank lobby was now as dense as a solid block, compressed by the simultaneous presence of the board members, Diane Walker, and above all, by the silent, calm presence of Amelia Carter, like a glacier unmoving at the center of the storm. Amelia didn't need to speak in haste. She stood there, amidst all the gazes fixed upon her, between the pale faces of those who had once dared to underestimate her, and among the customers who held their breath, waiting for something monumental to happen. Amelia turned to face Jessica Harper, Mike Sanders, and Richard Evans, 3 people who were no longer the confident, steadfast employees behind the counter. They stood there, their eyes dazed, their faces as pale as shattered statues, while around them, every gaze from the customers, colleagues, and the bank's leaders silently sliced through them like invisible blades. Amelia didn't need to raise her voice. She simply allowed her voice to seep into the tense air surrounding them. Jessica Harper, Mike Sanders, Richard Evans, you are fired immediately. 7 short words. No extra explanation, no need for further details. But the weight of those words hit like a hammer on an anvil, sending shockwaves through the entire bank lobby, which had fallen into a deathly silence. Jessica's eyes widened, her lips trembling as if she wanted to object but couldn't form a word. Mike Sanders shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with panic, muttering repeatedly, "This can't be, this can't be." Richard Evans, who had mocked Amelia openly, now stood frozen, staring at her as if unable to believe that his world could crumble in just one morning. Jessica, still clinging to a faint hope, took a step forward, her voice rising sharply, almost shouting, "I demand a review." "This is a mistake. We were just following security procedures." Amelia stared directly at Jessica, her eyes not angry nor pitying, just the absolute calm of someone who had witnessed and understood the essence of the situation. She cut Jessica off, her voice soft but resolute. "There's no mistake here. You didn't follow the procedure. You discriminated. You insulted a customer, and you violated serious codes of conduct and federal regulations regarding fair financial services." Diane Walker, standing next to Amelia, nodded in confirmation, her gaze as cold as ice. "All actions have been recorded, both video and audio. We have enough evidence to file a violation report and, if necessary, file a lawsuit in federal court." Those words caused Jessica to falter, her legs almost giving way beneath her. She looked around, searching for a sympathetic gaze, looking for someone to step forward and defend her. But all the employees and customers now avoided her gaze as if she were a disaster. Beth Monroe silently bowed her head to the keyboard, too ashamed to look up. Other employees began to retreat further into the counter, as if hoping to become invisible. Mike Sanders stepped forward, trying weakly to argue, "We were just following the instructions. It was a system error, a lack of training." Amelia scoffed lightly, a smile devoid of any humor, then replied slowly, "Lack of training is never an excuse to disrespect, discriminate, or humiliate others. If you chose to treat a customer poorly because they don't fit your ideal image, that's not a training issue. That's a choice. And today you are facing the consequences of those choices." Diane gestured to the security team. 2 seasoned security officers stepped forward, politely but firmly requesting that Jessica, Mike, and Richard hand over their employee IDs and leave the branch immediately. Richard Evans, knowing he couldn't resist, silently removed his badge, his face flushed, lowering his head and trudging toward the door. Mike Sanders muttered a curse under his breath, but didn't dare argue further. He threw his badge onto the counter and followed Richard out. Only Jessica Harper, the woman who once arrogantly ran the entire branch, remained, her empty gaze fixed on Amelia, before her trembling hand removed her badge and tossed it to the floor as a final, desperate gesture. The sound of the badge hitting the cold marble floor was a small noise, but it resonated like a death knell for her 15-year career. Jessica was escorted out in deathly silence, the clicking of her heels on the floor like slow, measured steps marking the end. The glass doors closed behind them, permanently separating three people who had just been ousted from Meridian. Not just losing their jobs, but also their reputation, their future in the financial industry. In the bank lobby, no one clapped. No one cheered. Only the heavy silence remained. The silence of witnessing, of a painful lesson being etched into every mind. Amelia Carter turned back to face the remaining employees. Her voice rang out, deep and sharp, cutting through the confusion. From today on, Meridian Bank will have no place for discrimination, bias, or arrogance. Anyone not willing to change can leave right now. She paused, her cold gaze sweeping across every face. Is there anyone who would like to try? No one spoke. Diane stood silently beside her, her gaze filled with respect. Jonathan Prescott and the other board members slowly nodded, silently acknowledging. Today, Amelia Carter was not just the CEO. She was the embodiment of the fairness they once promised to uphold, but had forgotten. The purge had begun, and Meridian Bank, if it hoped to survive, would have to learn to be reborn from the ashes of the arrogance that had just been blown away. The silence enveloped the bank lobby after the three dismissed employees were escorted out, leaving behind cold footsteps and heavy stares like hammer blows. None of the remaining staff dared to move or speak. The air was thick, almost solid, compressed by the weight of what had just transpired, and by the steadfast presence of Amelia Carter, who stood in the middle of the lobby like an unwavering pillar. Amelia, with her calm demeanor like that of a frozen mountain, slowly turned her head, her gaze settling on the small, trembling figure behind the counter. Beth Monroe, the young woman who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, her small shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Beth knew. She knew her moment of judgment had come. She remembered every moment of that dreadful morning. The confused yet avoidant look she had when she saw how Amelia was treated. The faint pang of discomfort when she watched Mike Sanders and Richard Evans sneer, but she didn't have the courage to speak up. The countless times she pretended to be busy, typing mindlessly, avoiding the truth unfolding right in front of her. Now, there was no place left to hide. Beth squeezed her sweaty hands into the hem of her uniform, her eyes lowered to the floor, waiting for the words that would end her young career, a sentence for her silent complicity. Amelia walked slowly toward the counter where Beth stood. Each of her steps seemed to carve deeper into everyone's mind, like the ringing of a bell, forcing them to face their own conscience. Beth looked up, her eyes red, bracing for the punishment. But Amelia didn't yell. She didn't insult. She didn't humiliate. She simply stood before Beth, her gaze deep and calm, like a still lake. A long pause, long enough for Beth to feel the chaotic beating of her own heart. Then Amelia spoke, her voice low but without coldness. Beth Monroe, I've been watching you from the start. I saw your discomfort. I saw you know something was wrong, but you didn't speak up. Beth felt her body freeze. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to cry out for forgiveness, but her throat constricted, her lips moving soundlessly. Amelia continued, her voice not heavy, but carrying the weight of truth. Silence in the face of injustice, even if not malicious, is complicity, and that needs to change. Beth closed her eyes, waiting for the final blow, the words that would end it all. But instead, she heard Amelia continue, her voice softening unexpectedly, bringing with it an unforeseen hope. However, I also see something different in you. different from those who chose to mock instead of intervene, different from those who simply nodded along with what was wrong. Beth slowly opened her eyes, her pupils filled with tears, unable to believe what she was hearing. Amelia smiled faintly, a rare, warm, and genuine smile. Because of that, instead of firing you, I'm giving you a chance. The entire bank lobby seemed to focus all its attention on this conversation. Other employees, customers still standing, everyone went silent. Amelia took half a step back, speaking clearly before the entire branch. Beth Monroe will be appointed as the interim manager of the flagship branch. Whispers of astonishment spread like waves. A few people gasped. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to feel happy or fearful for themselves. Beth could hardly stand. She raised a hand to her mouth, tears spilling uncontrollably. Amelia took another step forward, her voice no longer sharp but filled with empowerment. You've witnessed what can happen when we let indifference and prejudice creep into our work. Now, Beth, you'll lead this branch differently, with respect, fairness, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Beth nodded repeatedly, tears rolling down her cheeks, but in her eyes, for the first time, there was a glimmer of resolve. Amelia smiled faintly, then turned to the remaining staff. Anyone who wants to work in a fair bank, where customers are treated with genuine respect, stay and work with Beth. Anyone who is not ready to change, the front door is open. No one moved, no one left. A minute passed, then 2. Diane Walker, standing beside, smiled gently, nodding to Amelia, a silent acknowledgement that they had just witnessed a turning point. Beth Monroe wiped her tears, stepped out from behind the counter, now standing in front of her colleagues, now the interim manager, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of her new role resting on her small shoulders. But this time, she didn't retreat. And on that very day, in the lobby, still echoing with the footsteps of the 3 dismissed employees, a new chapter was written. One that began with remorse, the lesson of silence, and the courageous decision of a woman who seemed to have no more chances. As Beth Monroe stood firm before the employees and customers in the flagship branch lobby, her determined gaze silently affirmed that a new era had begun. But beyond the thick glass walls and cold marble floors, the aftershock from the incident was no longer confined to the flagship branch. It had spread, like a powerful earthquake, throughout the entire Meridian bank system. 3 hours later, in a spacious press room at the headquarters, everything was ready. A row of microphones were neatly arranged on the podium. The camera lights blazed brightly. Reporters from major news outlets, CNN, Bloomberg, Reuters, had gathered, their faces showing no signs of hiding their eagerness and curiosity about the sudden press conference that Meridian had urgently called. On the stage, Amelia Carter walked out, her gait confident and commanding. No need for a grand performance, no long introductions. Her presence alone, simple but unwavering, was enough to silence the murmurs in the room. She stopped behind the podium, scanning the faces waiting attentively, then nodded slightly. Amelia's voice rang out, clear and sharp, each word hitting like a hammer on the old, brittle foundation of an ancient system. Today, Meridian Bank officially announces the launch of a new initiative, the Fairness and Internal Reconstruction Program, with an initial investment of $50 million. A wave of murmurs spread through the room, but Amelia didn't stop. She continued, her voice sharp as a blade, cutting through the fog of empty justifications. This money will be entirely dedicated to eliminating discriminatory practices across the entire bank system, restructuring hiring processes, retraining all levels of employees in leadership, and building an internal culture based on respect, fairness, and integrity. A reporter raised her hand, signaling to ask a question, and hurriedly asked, "Can you explain how this initiative will be implemented? Is it just a temporary PR move?" Amelia smiled, a smile not bitter or exaggerated, but the smile of someone who had anticipated this question. "No, this is not a PR stunt. This is a root-level change. Starting today, every branch of Meridian Bank will no longer be evaluated solely on sales, profits, or new account numbers." She paused, letting her next words sink deep into every person sitting in the room. "We will evaluate the effectiveness of our branches based on a new standard, the quality of fair service. That means the ability to serve customers without discrimination based on race, social status, income, or appearance. Branches that fail to meet this standard will not receive bonuses, will not be promoted, and if necessary, will be shut down." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Never before had a national financial institution publicly declared such a hardline and thorough policy, especially when it could directly impact short-term revenue. But Amelia Carter didn't blink. She had witnessed firsthand the cost of indifference. Not just declining numbers, but the erosion of trust in real people. A female reporter from the New York Times asked next, her voice mixed with admiration, "Ms. Carter, do you have a message for the employees of Meridian Bank after today's event?" Amelia leaned into the microphone, her eyes sparkling with unwavering determination. "I have a simple message. If you don't believe that every customer, regardless of how they look, how much they earn, or what they wear, deserves to be treated with absolute respect and fairness, then Meridian Bank is not the place for you." The silence after that statement was heavier than any applause, for everyone knew that was not just a policy declaration. That was a declaration of war, uncompromising, unyielding, against a rotting culture that had silently embedded itself in the financial industry for decades. Diane Walker, sitting in the front row, silently smiled. She knew now they had truly begun, not with flowery statements, but with concrete action, with new, unbending standards that no one could bypass. As Amelia Carter left the podium, no one remained seated. Each person, each small group, jumped up, surrounding one another in lively exchanges, rushing to call editorial offices headquarters. The Meridian Bank story would be the headline in every paper tomorrow. Not because of a scandal, but because they had dared to do what many only talked about. Amelia stepped out of the press room, her simple blazer fluttering lightly behind her with each steady step. She knew the battle ahead would be long. There would be hidden opposition, forces trying to maintain the status quo for their own benefit. But she also knew one thing more certainly than anything else. The decayed culture she had just declared war on had officially received its death sentence. Stepping out of the press conference room, Amelia Carter did not allow herself to relax for even a second. She knew all too well. The public announcement was just the first step. The real battle, far more difficult and dirty, awaited her at the very top floor of Meridian Bank, where power plays and covert battles had never cooled. As expected, when she returned to the strategy room where the board members were gathered, the atmosphere had completely changed. Where they had previously sat silently listening to the recordings from the flagship branch, now tension, frustration, and concern crept into every glance, every grip on the edge of the table. Jonathan Prescott, the chairman of the board, was the first to speak, his voice low but sharp. "Amelia, do you even know what you've just done?" She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "I did exactly what needed to be done." Catherine Reynolds, another seasoned member with elegant silver hair and a sharp gaze, leaned back, arms crossed, and sighed. A $50 million initiative? Evaluating branch performance based on fair service? Amelia, you're putting the entire company in jeopardy. Dennis Whitehill, ever the pragmatist, gruffly interjected, Meridian's reputation will be torn to shreds out there. The media won't just report on the reforms. They'll dredge up every old scandal. Have you considered the consequences? Amelia looked at each of them in turn. Her gaze was as sharp as a razor, but her voice remained calm. I haven't just considered it. I've prepared for all of it. Jonathan slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing so loudly that several members of the board jumped. You acted without consulting us. You've declared war on the entire banking system in Meridian's name. What right do you have? Amelia didn't blink. She knew this moment would come, and she had prepared thoroughly. Slowly, she opened the folder she was holding, pulling out a series of printed images, photos captured from the surveillance cameras at the flagship branch. One showed Jessica Harper refusing to serve Amelia. Another captured Mike Sanders and Richard Evans mocking a customer. A series of comparisons highlighted the differential treatment between white customers and others. A copy of an internal email where regional managers ignored previous warnings of discrimination. Amelia placed each sheet down on the table, her movement slow but certain. Finally, she looked up, her gaze hard. This is evidence. Not rumors, not accusations. Hard, irrefutable visual and audio proof. No one in the room could speak a word. Amelia continued, her voice as cold as a blade cutting through the air. If you want to stop my initiative, fine. But remember, when the first class action lawsuit from discriminated customers hits, and it will soon, this evidence will be brought out in federal court, and the entire board, as the people who knew and did nothing, will be held personally accountable. Jonathan Prescott shivered slightly. Catherine Reynolds' face went pale, and for the first time her eyes revealed real worry. Dennis Whitehill clenched his jaw, his eyes cold, but in his mind he knew. Amelia had just dropped a bomb right in the middle of the room, and there was no way out. Amelia knew they were weighing their options. She delivered another fatal blow. I'm not just concerned about reputation. I'm concerned about our banking license. If violations of federal financial fairness regulations are proven, Meridian could lose its license in at least 3 states. She looked deeply into the eyes of each member, and I assure you, I will not hide the truth. If necessary, I will testify before Congress. A wave of deadly silence washed over the room. Jonathan, with the experience of a seasoned politician, knew better than anyone. At this point, they had no real choice. Amelia Carter, simple, composed, but resolute, had created a trap where any misstep would lead to total annihilation. He sighed, slowly nodded. Bring the draft initiative here. We'll sign it. Catherine and Dennis exchanged glances, then reluctantly nodded in agreement. A minute later, under the bright white lights of the boardroom, high-end fountain pens signed the $50 million initiative commitment, affirming the complete overhaul of Meridian Bank's system, not just out of pressure but for survival. Amelia gathered her papers, her expression serene, but inside, a complex mix of emotions surged. This victory was not sweet. It was a necessary victory, won through pressure, cold persuasion, and by not allowing anyone, even the most powerful figures, to escape responsibility. As she left the boardroom, stepping into the vast hallway with glass walls overlooking the city, the evening sky began to glow with a brilliant golden hue. A peaceful scene that stood in stark contrast to the earthquake that had just shaken inside. Amelia Carter knew she had won the right to open the door to reform. But behind that door, there was still a long and challenging road ahead. When Amelia Carter gently closed the door to the conference room behind her, she knew a new chapter had officially begun. No more empty promises, no more polished reports hiding the truth, no more polite but cold smiles to customers. From that day forward, Meridian Bank had to change, or it would cease to exist. In less than 2 weeks after the board of directors was forced to approve the initiative, the new set of criteria was issued and sent to the entire branch system nationwide, accompanied by an unprecedented restructuring decree in the bank's history. Every branch, whether in a bustling city center or a small remote town, had to adhere to one core principle. Every customer, regardless of background, appearance, wealth, or social status, must be served with absolute respect. No exceptions, no justifications, no delays. Amelia understood that to change a culture that had been rotting for decades, sheer willpower wasn't enough. It required real evaluation systems, reward and punishment mechanisms strong enough to change behavior before changing mindsets. Therefore, a two-way evaluation system was established. Customers would have the right to anonymously rate the quality of service after each transaction. Employees also had the right to report discriminatory behavior from colleagues, with a strict commitment to protect whistleblowers. And most importantly, bonuses, promotions, and even employment contracts were now directly tied to the fair service scores given to customers, not just the number of new accounts or credit sales as before. To ensure transparency, secret surveys and mystery shopping tests would be conducted regularly. Branches with high rates of discrimination would lose their bonuses, have their leadership suspended, and in severe cases be closed down. At first, these announcements caused an uproar internally. Many branch managers, accustomed to prioritizing well-dressed customers, quietly complained, arguing that the new policy was too idealistic and not practical for business. Some tellers, who had once prided themselves on serving VIP customers, felt threatened and confused by the new standards they had never considered before. But Amelia had anticipated all of it. She wasn't soft, nor did she argue. Instead, she pointed to the cold, hard facts. In the past 3 years, the churn rate of minority customers was 3 times higher than that of white customers, and most of them had moved to other financial institutions thriving on fairness. With irrefutable data, sharp market research, Amelia proved that. Fairness in service wasn't just ethics, it was a vital business strategy. Opposition gradually diminished. Under close supervision, each branch began to change. At first, the changes were reluctant. Awkward smiles to a casually dressed customer. Polite greetings even when the person didn't seem like a potential client. But gradually, through repeated training sessions, through public performance boards in the internal system, and through clear rewards for employees with high fair service scores, a silent but steady transformation began to take root. In a small branch in Colorado, the new manager, after receiving anonymous feedback that her staff was cold toward immigrant workers, organized a special training on multicultural service, and customer loyalty rates increased by 17% in just 4 months. At a large branch in Chicago, a veteran employee, known for only prioritizing well-dressed customers, was reported by a colleague, and after a fair internal investigation, was transferred, while the whistleblower was rewarded. The press quickly caught up with this shift. A Wall Street Journal article praised Meridian Bank, from crisis to symbol of fair financial reform. Business Insider reported, the first bank in America to make fair service the measure of success, and it's winning big. At the same time, federal financial regulatory organizations, who had once considered investigating Meridian, now looked to the bank's internal evaluation model as a benchmark for the 21st century banking industry. Amelia Carter didn't appear much in the media after that. She let actions speak louder than words. Instead of loud speeches, she focused on surprise branch visits, private meetings with frontline employees, and direct training sessions where she listened rather than directed. Because she understood, sustainable change doesn't come from grand declarations. It comes from each person, each interaction, each small decision, repeated every day. And gradually, from the smallest branches to the largest financial hubs, Meridian Bank began to transform, little by little, without compromise, without retreat. The transformation of Meridian Bank was no longer just on paper or in internal reports. It was tangible, clear, visible, in every smallest detail across all branches, from the most remote towns to the bustling financial avenues. And there was one detail, though simple, but carrying more weight than any speech or strategic plan, that had appeared. At every service desk, every entrance, every customer service area, a new sign was installed with a single line, etched in bright brass. All customers deserve to be treated with dignity and fairness. If your experience does not reflect this, please contact the CEO's office directly, Amelia Carter. No more convoluted customer service departments. No more standard scripted apologies. Between the highest leader and every customer, there was only a straightforward, transparent connection, full of commitment. When this decision was announced, many regional directors were shocked. In the banking industry, where the gap between senior executives and customers is carefully maintained through countless layers of bureaucracy, opening a direct channel for complaints to the CEO was unprecedented. But Amelia Carter wasn't seeking false security. She was seeking real change. And she understood that only direct accountability, without intermediaries, without covering up, would force the system to purge itself. 1 month after the signs were installed nationwide, Amelia decided to take an action that very few people in her position would dare to do. She returned to the branches, in her simple guise, just like the first day. No entourage, no prior announcement. Just herself, in a dark purple hoodie, dark jeans, neatly tied low hair, and a soft leather crossbody bag, looking no different than an ordinary customer visiting the bank on a Saturday morning. She walked into the flagship branch, the same place where only a few months ago she had been publicly humiliated. But this time, everything was different. As soon as Amelia pushed the door open, a young receptionist, around 25, immediately stood up straight, smiled brightly, and greeted her. "Good morning. Welcome to Meridian Bank. How can I assist you today?" His voice held no trace of artificiality, no scrutinizing gaze, no hidden arrogance, no checking her appearance for flaws. Amelia nodded slightly and walked deeper into the lobby. At the service desk, a middle-aged female employee politely invited her over, engaging with a rare level of courtesy and respect. When Amelia requested a small transaction, the teller not only handled it promptly, but also explained every step clearly, with genuine patience and professionalism. As Amelia glanced at the new, gleaming sign beside the counter, where the commitment to fairness stood out under the lighting, a light smile crossed her face. Without needing to ask, she could sense it. The service attitude here had changed, not out of fear or coercion, but out of an awakening. After flagship, Amelia continued quietly visiting other branches, from the crowded ones in downtown New York to the smaller ones in suburban Wisconsin. At each location, each transaction, every interaction, Amelia noticed the same fundamental shift. Employees looked at customers as equals, without judgment. Tellers proactively offered assistance, treating everyone with respect and without distinction. Branches clearly displayed the new commitments, and behind the counters the fairness benchmarks, alongside sales targets, were updated every month. Of course, not every branch was perfect. At times, Amelia still encountered awkward glances, gestures that weren't quite natural. But more importantly, the change had begun to take root. No more indifference, no more silent complicity like before. One evening, after leaving a small branch in San Antonio, Texas, following a brief transaction, a young teller hurried after her to the door. Breathing heavily from excitement, the girl handed her a small piece of paper. Miss Carter, right? I recognized you. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for giving us a bank we can be proud to work for." Amelia paused for a moment. She took the piece of paper. It was a small card with hastily written words: respect, integrity, courage. No speech, no award could warm Amelia's heart as much as that simple moment. She nodded gently, gripped the girl's hand tightly, and turned to walk away, the breeze gently lifting the stray hair from her forehead. That day, amid the golden sunset along the avenue, Amelia Carter knew that, even though there was still a long road ahead, the seeds she had planted had truly begun to grow, not just changing a bank, but changing the way ordinary people look at each other, with true respect, dignity, and fairness. And she silently promised herself, this commitment, it would be forever. The story of Amelia Carter and the journey to transform Meridian Bank shows us that true change doesn't start with grand speeches, but with small actions, in how we treat each person with fairness and dignity. If you've ever experienced a moment where determination and justice spoke louder than anything else, are you ready to stand up and defend what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you find this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful journey. We have many more great stories ahead.